Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar series on the implications of the disease caused by the new strain of coronavirus, COVID-19. We have a group of our lawyers presenting today from various practice specialties to share our broad thoughts with you. Our idea is to be helpful. These are complex issues. Things are constantly evolving. We intend to present this webinar each Tuesday at noon. We may need to do others more frequently, and we'll do so as needed. We're also here to help you 24/7. Three quick housekeeping items that I'd like to touch on before we get started. Please enter your questions using the Q&A box on your screen. We will not be able to answer all questions submitted today. We've got a lot of attendees on the line. We're pleased by that. But we'll do our best to answer the questions that are most prevalent and answer as many questions as possible. Feel free to call your bond attorney with any questions and concerns you may have as this situation develops. There's also a survey at the end of the presentation. We very much appreciate your feedback, so we would appreciate it if you can spend a minute on that when this is complete. This webinar is also going to be recorded. And it's going to be available on our website by sometime tomorrow afternoon. So with that, I'd like to jump right in. We don't have a lot of time today. My name is Pete Jones. I'm happy to be your moderator. We're going to start off today with Hermes Fernandez. Hermes is resident in our Albany office. He's the head of our healthcare practice group. He's got expertise in healthcare, government, and regulatory affairs. And Hermes is going to say a few words about the New York State, the Governor Cuomo's declaration of a state of emergency and some of the public health announcements and advisories that accompany this crisis. Hermes, take it away.
Thank you, Peter. So as Peter said, this is a rapidly evolving situation, not simply just from the science and from the healthcare issues, but from the legal perspective as well. We're seeing fast and furious directives coming both at the federal level and at the state level, and I believe actually at the local level in New York City as well. We are now dealing with new statutory constructions and new regulatory constructions. For those of you who are healthcare providers on this call, you're familiar with the fact that the state of New York has something called the State Sanitary Code. The State Sanitary Code is one of the fundamental pillars of healthcare protection in the state of New York. The State Sanitary Code reaches things like drinking water, pools, campgrounds, all kinds of things that go to the fundamentals of public health, keeping people and places clean and infection-free. That code dates back 100 years. It's been used, over the years, it's been used less frequently, but it has come up more recently in things like measles outbreaks. Now we're seeing the use of this, the State Sanitary Code in regard to this new communicable disease, right, a contagious disease, COVID-19. What the Department of Health has done along with the governor is a week ago, 9 days ago now, the governor negotiated further emergency powers. The governor already held emergency powers in the case of a epidemic, an outbreak, which is what we're looking at now. He negotiated further emergency powers with the legislature a week ago, 9 days ago. The governor had the authority to suspend various laws that might slow down a public response to a healthcare crisis like this. The legislature agreed, and it was highly controversial, but the legislature agreed to give the governor power not just to suspend laws, but actually to issue decrees through executive orders. So the governor now has the authority to suspend laws and to make laws. These laws will only last for up to 30 days. The governor would have to issue new executive orders to renew them. The legislature can step in and overrule the governor on this, but that's the basic structure. Following the adoption of the new law, the governor issued an executive order on March 7th, so 3 days ago. And the executive order was quite expansive. The governor, it went 3 pages, 3 long pages, the 11.5 by the 14-inch pages, not the 11-inch pages. He suspended quite a number of laws, and those laws go to things like when do you have to have a licensed professional deliver health care? When can other people step in? What happens with quarantine? What happens with isolation? And then following that, yesterday, the State Public Health and Health Planning Council, which is independent of the State Health Department but works closely with the State Health Department, issued 31 pages of emergency regulations governing just these same kinds of things. And the regulations are striking in their breadth, and they're striking in their what they are attempting to do. Again, going to healthcare professionals, the regulations waive certain professional licensing rules. There's going to be the opportunity to train other people without licenses who will work under the supervision of a nurse or a physician to do things like testing of people who may have been exposed to the virus. The rules, though, I think are also extremely important because they also address issues of social distancing, isolation, and quarantine. Social distancing is keeping people apart from one another in order to stop the disease from spreading, right? At this point, there's no vaccine, there's no known cure, so we are limited to the abilities that our ancestors had, right? Which is keeping people away from one another and then trying to check the spread of the disease in that way. So social distancing is things like calling off events, telling people not to get on cruise ships, and telling people things like work at home or stay 3 to 6 feet away from others. The 3 to 6 feet is important because that apparently is what is believed to be the distance in which this disease can spread from one person to the next. This is not a disease that lingers in the air because you've been in a room where someone else is in that room. That's not what is going to make you sick. It is closer contact. It is sneezing, coughing, those kinds of things that will do it. The new regulations, the governor's new authority, can command isolation. And so that means the governor, the health department, and delegated down to county department of health departments, district health departments, which cover the entire state, local officials acting under this authority can command someone to stay home, to stay away from other people. They can also issue quarantine orders. Quarantine is similar to isolation, but different in that quarantine is a place, right? If you are quarantined in a place, you're quarantining everybody in that place. That's what we're seeing happening with things like the cruise ships, right? Those are quarantines for everyone in those places. So I'm very close to the conclusion of my 7 minutes here, but what we're seeing is very significant authorities being provided to state government, which will be exercised by the governor, exercised by the State Department of Health, and then evolving down, delegated down to local districts. So in New York City, right, there's the New York City Department of Health, a very capable body that will be handling these things. At the county level, we'll see the same kinds of things. If you have questions about issuing an order, whether it makes sense for you to do something in terms of cleanup, whether it makes sense for you to say, even though there's no government official saying do this, but it's something you may think you should do regarding a staff person, anybody, you can call the county departments of health, who will give you at least their best guide regarding what the health ramifications are and whether the health issues support what it is you intend to do. And with that, Pete, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Hermes. Next, we have Monica Barrett. Monica is a practitioner in our higher education practice group. She's the co-chair of that group. She's a nationally recognized expert in higher education and labor and employment law. And Monica is resident in our New York City office. Monica, take it away.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks, Pete. In my allotted time, I'm going to speak about what employers should be doing now. And our recommendation is the following 5 things, which I will first list, and then I'll talk in a little bit more detail about each of them. So the 5 things: 1, communicate with employees. 2, brush off or develop a business disruption plan. Number 3, Remind supervisors of the proper protocols for sick leave and medical leave. Number 4, determine the employer-sponsored travel policy and consider providing warnings to employees about their personal travel during their vacations. And 5, finally and most importantly, set out a plan for alternative work arrangements. Now, communicating with employees. I'll remind you, I'm speaking here from New York City, so the situation is a lot different here than it is upstate. A lot of employers down here are communicating with employees by having CDC guidance, having links to CDC guidance, World Health Organization guidance, and New York State Department of Health guidance. There are easy links. You can put it out in an email to your employees. And that's particularly about basic hygiene recommendations and also recommendations about travel. Communicate about plans for your future events that you as an employer might be holding, business closure plans. Even if you're not planning to close now, let employees know that you're thinking about, you're planning for that possibility. And also communicate your policies about sick time and PTO time. And then also finally communicate about alternative work arrangements. How to communicate, I would recommend, if you can develop a website, put a website up and communicate regularly. Here, a lot of employers in New York have websites devoted to COVID-19, and they also send out emails, and all the emails are on the website. So employees can find out on a daily basis whether things have changed, whether the businesses are set to be closed in any short period of time. Number 2, brush off or develop a business disruption plan. Most large employers keep their business disruption plans out of public view. So unfortunately, they're difficult to find on the web. However, in order to develop a business disruption plan, simply review what your practices have been during weather emergencies, such as Hurricane Irene back in 2011, Hurricane Sandy in 2015, and blizzards when you're forced to close your offices. In New York City after 9/11, of course, most employers in downtown Manhattan had to come up with business disruption plans that lasted for about 6 months. Think about essential services necessary to keep your organization running. In weather emergencies, obviously your facilities department are clearly essential, as they would be with a communicable disease emergency. If the majority of your employees will be working from home during any period of time, any mandatory business closure, your IT personnel will likely be essential, as will your senior leadership. Many private schools here in New York City are closed, but their teachers are required to be present on campus because they're considered essential. Number 3, remind supervisors of the proper protocols for sick leave and medical leave. Remember, not everyone who calls out sick is calling out because they have COVID-19. Remind supervisors of that fact. If anyone calls out sick and indicates they have symptoms of fever, coughing, and shortness of breath, instruct them to stay home until their fever is under 100 degrees, at least for 24 hours without medication. If an employee calls out sick and reports such symptoms and indicates they have traveled recently from a country with increased COVID-19 and or had contact with someone who's been infected, I recommend that you contact your public health authorities for advice and take guidance from the public health authorities. If an employee exhibits symptoms of coughing, sneezing, and shortness of breath, and a fever, and they come to work, you may ask them to leave the workplace and stay at home until they recover. The use of sick time is certainly appropriate when employees are sick with COVID-19 during the recovery period and during any required isolation period. Some of my clients have asked me whether they can take a targeted approach and advise those employees who are over the age of 60 to stay home if they're considered, since they're considered to be at more serious risk of the illness being worse if they're infected, or people with underlying health conditions. I would not recommend a targeted approach. Some of my clients have decided to go out with a message that invites those employees who consider themselves at high risk to contact HR to discuss their situation. Now, fourth recommendation is to convey to employees what your employer-sponsored travel policy will be. Most employers are canceling events down here in New York City and prohibiting employer-sponsored travel. Non-essential travel, obviously you can eliminate that, but there may be essential travel that's necessary. And then finally, set out a plan for alternative work arrangements. Now, in concluding, I just want to emphasize that this is going to be very specific to individual employers about what alternative work arrangements are. Here in New York City, it's pretty obvious a lot of employers are implementing alternative work arrangements, because this morning on the subway, it was probably 1/3 as full at 8:45 as it normally is. And when I got on the subway, I didn't have to touch another person. It was so easy to get around, and no one was pushing up against me. And everybody was exercising subway surfing, which means a wide stance, and nobody was holding on to the poles. So people are exercising social distancing down here in New York City. And hopefully it will be working. And I'll turn it back to you, Pete.
Thank you, Monica. And I think that's an excellent point that probably pertains across all of our presentations, and that is everybody's approach, I think, will be a little bit unique. Some of these principles, a lot of the things we're talking about are hopefully helpful. But when we get down to the granular level, people are going to have to make their own choices that fit their workplace culture, their organization, and their risk philosophy. So next up is Rod McDonald. Rod is a corporate lawyer with a healthcare practice. He's got expertise in governance, compliance, organizational structure. Rod is resident in our Syracuse office. And he's going to talk about some of the issues relative to canceling events, the contract insurance issues, some of the financial implications that'll go along with that. Rod?
Thank you, Peter. So in addition to businesses having to consider how this situation affects their employees and their operations, they also need to consider the relationship with customers and suppliers and other third party that they have contracts with. So the first thing to do is look back at your contracts. What do they say? Do they have the ability for you or the other party to terminate for any reason on 30 or 60 days notice? A lot of contracts have that, many don't, but and that's obviously a drastic. I don't think most businesses are going to just exercise the right to terminate, but as you're going into discussions with a customer or a supplier, it's good to know what the contract provides as far as your rights and the other party's rights. Another key type of contract provision that everyone's focusing now is called the force majeure provision, French term meaning superior force. And these provisions seek to protect parties to a contract from being held to an obligation that because of events that are outside of their control and their reasonable expectations, they cannot fulfill their obligations. The issue of whether these apply, these force majeure provisions apply, is very fact specific to the way the provision is written, and then just the facts of the relationship between the parties. One thing you should know is that it's a very high standard to show that force majeure should apply and give you a pass, as it were, from your contractual obligations. And as of now, while Hermes talked about the governor's the powers that he's accrued through the declaration, there's been no exercise of those powers that we think would, in most cases, trigger ability to use a force majeure clause at this point. As you know, if he uses power to shut down a throughway, I mean, that could change. But right now, the consensus is that tough, depending on what your force majeure clause, probably tough to exercise right now and reasonably rely on that. Another sort of, and the New York courts narrowly construe force majeure clauses. And if you don't even have a force majeure clause in your contract, the courts are not going to imply one or read one in there. So in that case, you may be, if you cannot fulfill a contract, you may be relying on the doctrine of impossibility of performance, which if force majeure is a hard standard to meet, that's an even higher standard to meet. Another thing to think about is if you're a party, if you're a borrower under a finance contract, most force majeure does not typically provide for relief from a payment obligation. So most finance contracts are not going to give a borrower an out for meeting its obligations to the lender based on force majeure. But if you're a borrower, you ought to consider the impact on my business going to affect my covenants. Is it going to create an event of default under my loan documents? We have a situation, I was talking to one of my colleagues yesterday, a borrower is seeking to change its bank, and it received the loan documents from its new proposed bank, and they have a provision that says it's an event of default if you're closed for more than a week for 20 hours a day. And this client happens to be in a line of business where the Department of Health could actually shut them down for that period of time. So it's a real concern, and they need to decide what they're going to do. Do they switch banks and take the risk? Do they try to go back? You know, it's something that they're dealing with. And that brings me, in addition to the importance of looking at the terms of your existing contracts, people are looking forward now and negotiating their contracts going forward, and specifically trying to, if it applies, negotiate specific outs for a pandemic or a situation like this, a public health situation. And we have another colleague was telling me about a client that is doing a launch for a new product line in the fashion industry, and it's in New York City in a couple of weeks, and she's negotiating with a model who is trying to insert provisions into her contract that says, if for some reason I can't go because of the coronavirus, you know, I won't be in breach of the contract. I'll do other things to fulfill my obligations. So those are the type of negotiations that are happening every day right now. As far as cancellations, because that's high on everyone's list right now. I have an event. Should I cancel? It's tough because, as I mentioned, the government has not issued proclamations or decrees or laws that would probably trigger force majeure. And the business interruption insurance, you know, it's not like this is there's a fire or a flood or a specific direct event. So the insurance carriers are saying, hey, you know, business insurance isn't going to, interruption insurance is not going to help you if you cancel your event. So, you know, what do you do? In addition to considering your contract exposure, I think you have to think about your tort exposure. You know, if you're an event center, there's definitely bodies of case law that said you can be held liable if you hold an event when you reasonably should have known that people could get sick coming to your event. And so I think, you know, people need to think about that as well. And so it's a tough spot if you're trying. trying to decide whether to cancel. I think that, just in the last 24 hours, a lot of, I think Harvard, Princeton, Stanford are canceling classes. And it probably is more, I think there was a big tennis tournament that was canceled. The NCAA is talking about playing the tournament in front of no fans. So I think as more businesses cancel their events, probably it'll be a groundswell towards canceling, despite maybe not having a clear force majeure or have confidence that you'll recover on your insurance policies. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rod. Next up, we've got Jen Swarzout. Jen is a partner in our litigation practice in our Rochester office. She's got expertise in healthcare litigation, and one of the things that I think is very helpful is the perspective of someone who's litigated cases, because a lot of times what you get is some insight into things that can go wrong, and some of the insights in those areas. So Jen's going to talk about best resources to stay up to date, but I think she'll probably offer some of her observations, practical observations as well. So take it away, Jen.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm hoping to provide a little more calm here on my part of this and talk about the resources, because I think it's important that we take into mind what is actually out there. Starting, the Center for Disease Control is a great resource, and cdc.gov is the easiest way to get there. I think when you go onto that site, it really, I've been following along a lot of the questions that are being asked, and there's a lot of great resources and answers to a lot of those questions, and so I would encourage folks to do that. But they talk about the science that's going on, the research that's been going on, the testing, the availability of testing, the types of information that you need to know to make the decisions that Monica was talking about with your employees, as well as the decisions that Rod was talking about with whether you should cancel something. It puts various categories of risk and discussion. And there is a weekly briefing that's available. They just have it on Mondays. There was an audio recording that was posted last night, and that should be available by transcript in the next couple of days on the website. Also, for travel questions, the CDC is the resource. You might have seen in many of the media reports things referencing the different levels of travel. So whether you're level 2, level 3, level 1, it outlines what that actually means, which is very helpful. And it identifies country by country where there are risks, where you should be more mindful of that. I've seen through the Q&A that's been popping up, people have various questions about various countries, and I would encourage you to review that source. Right now, the level 3 countries are limited to Italy, Iran, China, and South Korea. Level 2 is limited to Japan, and level 3 is Hong Kong. So there's been various questions about countries that are not included in those group I just mentioned. You can go onto the CDC website and find out specific details related to those countries. Here in New York, I think that Hermes referenced several times all of the work that New York State has been doing. I would encourage you to look at the Department of Health, the information they have available on their website. They have an additional whole section dedicated to COVID-19, and that's a great resource. They have guidance on cleaning and disinfectant, and in combination with the New York State Department of Education, they have information specific to K-12 schools, daycares, and higher ed, and the things that you should be thinking about if you're operating a school, if your kids are in school, and those sorts of questions that you may have are there. At this point in time, the Department of Health for each particular county will be the determinant of whether a school should be closed. So a public school, if there's a report, the county health department will contact you and make that determination. So if you are with a school and you're not sure, should I close or should I not, that's a determination that the county will make and notify you if you are in that situation. Each of the county, and I went on various ones for upstate last night, Monroe, Erie, Onondaga, all the county websites have additional information about COVID-19 and the reported cases, if any. Those counties I just mentioned don't have any at this point, but the State Department of Health website has county by county where there have been a coronavirus diagnosis. And so that could be of good import for you. A couple of the questions I saw indicated, will we be sending this information? Honestly, the fastest way probably would be for you to just go on or have your folks, team members and various different employees check out these resources. I think to Monica's point earlier, referencing these, if you are going to do a communication piece, is a good idea, because I think it's important here to stick with what is known and as well as what's not. And so certainly if you Google, which I did in advance of today, coronavirus, you get all sorts of media reports from various different media entities that certainly are creating a lot of concern and fear, some of which is appropriate, obviously, but some of it is creating chaos where there doesn't necessarily need to be on some of the things that there has been discussion in these various resources about those issues. And so I would strongly encourage you to do that. From a litigation perspective, I mean, we really deal with the facts. To Rod's point a moment ago, what you should and shouldn't, the standard on the back end, let's say you cancel an event and there is a contract issue, that will be litigated based on the terms of the contract and how that would go. With regard to whether someone goes to an event and gets the coronavirus, I mean, from a proof standpoint, that would be really challenging. I think certainly if you knew in your facility that you had coronavirus and you knew that you didn't do a very good job of cleaning it before the next event came in, that's certainly a situation where there could be some potential liability there. But if you don't know any of that, to his point on what you should or should have known, if you really didn't have any reason to know any of that information, it would be certainly challenging to prove that. That doesn't mean, unfortunately, lawsuits won't be filed, but in terms of how they will check out, that will be depend on certainly the facts of the particular case. And with that, I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Pete, who I think is going to help us with working through some of these questions.
Okay, thank you, Jen. Thank you, everyone, for those overviews. We've got a lot to cover, so I'd like to kick it off. We're getting a lot of questions on, working from home versus working in the office and pay for people who are either directed to stay at home or, required to stay at home. And so, Monica, maybe you could spend just a minute or two kind of giving an overview on your thoughts on that and kind of kick us off, please.
Sure, and just as we were getting on the webinar, many of you probably got alerts about Harvard is essentially shutting down for the rest of the semester and sending the students home, and everything's going to be online. So I do a lot of work in higher ed, as does Pete, and many higher ed institutions are requiring their faculty to develop online courses, and they, of course, will continue to be paid. From unionized faculty, there is a bit of a pushback from institutions, public institutions here in New York City are pushing back about whether they'll be getting extra pay for that. But the basic issue is if you're assigning people to work from home, they should be continued to be paid. If you have a mandatory shutdown and people cannot come to work, as you would in a weather emergency, you would likely continue paying people, even those who cannot work from home, you would likely continue to pay them. It's different if they're sick, obviously. They should be using their sick time. I hope that answers the question, Pete.
Yeah, I think so, Monica. Thank you. I guess another thing to just sort of add there, we've had a few questions about the duty to bargain under the National Labor Relations Act, collective bargaining agreement clause applicability. I guess I would just note that, these are things that we're going to have to deal with on the fly. To the extent that you have a collective bargaining agreement, now would be a very good time to, sort of parse what the various provisions say, what your management rights clause says, whether you've got a clause that deals with emergencies, layoff clauses, all those sorts of things, just to understand what the baseline rules are. But I think we're going to need some flexibility in how we apply those. The other thing is we have had a lot of questions from clients about the duty to bargain under the National Labor Relations Act or under the Taylor Law. And I think those questions will be, dependent again on what's in your agreements, but also time may be of the essence. And bargaining sometimes is a timely and difficult process. So we may have to make some decisions and do the best we can in terms of notice to the unions and getting input from the unions, because we just may not have time to get the duty to bargain discharged to the extent that duty exists. I'd like to ask Rod to address. We've had some questions from our healthcare providers, and I'll put them sort of in two categories, and then I'll move out of the way so Rod can address them. But one is sort of in the office setting. What might a provider do? If someone comes in and presents, obviously sick with potentially symptoms of the coronavirus, or frankly any other kind of, sort of highly contagious condition. And then I think, sort of a related question, but, for our, for emergency providers and acute care providers, how might that answer differ?
Thanks, Pete. So last week I listened to a call from that was put on the Department of Health for providers, for physicians, and it was the speakers were all physicians from the Department of Health, and they said it's clear that the disease is in the community transmission phase, and physicians should prepare for a surge in patients. And they said you should dust out your emergency preparedness plans. You should think about where are you going to put people who appear to be at risk for the disease. Do you have separate entrances to your office? Do you need to train your staff at the front desk to look for symptoms, to ask questions? I think one question that we had that was specific to this came from someone who was an eye doctor, and they said, what if a patient presents, they're there for an eye exam, and they're coughing and they look like they have a fever? I think in that instance, it goes to the training of the staff, the person at the front desk, to recognize it. And I think you could tell the person that they need to, the question was, can we tell them to reschedule their appointment for another day and come back? And I think you could in that instance. An eye exam is not, they're not there to be treated for the coronavirus disease. So I think, again, it's facts and circumstances of each case, but definitely want to train your employees to look out for it and tell them what you think they should do. That you segregate them, tell them to come back. Hope that answers it. Thank you. Thanks.
Pete, this is Hermes. If I could add to that answer, healthcare providers should already have in place protocols in their office for dealing with communicable diseases. That's what coronavirus is, and those same protocols will lead them to the correct answers and how to deal with people coming into their offices. They do have requirements in terms of separating people from who may have a communicable disease from other circumstances. If there, some physicians' offices have rooms that can deal with air pressure, and there's protocols that have come out from the health department and from CDC about who goes into what rooms, how the room should be cleaned or disinfected after each patient comes in. Those should be looked at and then followed. So it's a pretty well established circumstance. That the one difference you'll see here is the reporting requirements that will follow. There were some protocols put up, I believe, yesterday or on Monday regarding what reporting a healthcare provider needs to do if they see a patient they believe to have coronavirus. And so that they will have to follow that protocol as well.
Thanks, Hermes. I'm going to come back to you in just a second with some questions on travel. But as with all these questions, I think once we start down the road, there are many layers on the onion, and we're getting a lot of questions, sort of follow up on the, do we have to pay employees who stay home, et cetera, et cetera. So let me see if I can summarize our thinking real quickly on that. You would start with what your policies provide, what your collective bargaining agreements provide as the baseline in terms of whether there would be pay in a situation where people are, not at work. We have special issues, obviously, associated with exempt employees. To the extent that an exempt employee performs work in a work week, generally they must be paid the salary for the entire work week. Governor Cuomo has proposed and suggested that people should be paid if they are directed to stay at home or required to stay at home because of the coronavirus or, things that are associated with that. That is not yet the legal baseline. There is the possibility that people who have been exposed at work could be covered by workers' compensation. And then there's the question that Monica, I think, got into, which is, what should you do, as a matter of policy, both to prevent people who are sick from coming in and infecting everybody else as a, kind of a, prophylactic measure, but also, to the extent that, we're trying to ameliorate the economic impact on people. So I think this is going to vary by organization. It's going to be a difficult question. There is no one size fits all answer. And, just working through your policies, what your legal obligations are under your agreements, and then what your, your culture and outlook is. The other thing that I've talked to some clients about is, we don't know how long this is going to last. And so, to the extent that people are out of work for a couple of days, that's a very different question than if people are out of work for a couple of weeks, which is a very different question from a couple of months. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies some of the pay questions. But Hermes, I did want to, we've gotten a lot of questions on travel. They relate to, people come back from areas where where the virus is more prevalent. There are also some questions about, voluntary people who decide to voluntarily travel to areas that may be high-risk areas, and frankly, just people coming back generally. So maybe you could share a few thoughts on that, and then we can open it to others on the panel.
Sure, Pete. Certainly a multi-layered question. We have to distinguish between local travel and international travel. If someone is traveling internationally, returning to the country now, to the United States, those folks may actually be subject to a 14-day quarantine period. There's certain countries that have already been identified, China, Iran. If you're coming back from those countries, right, there's an automatic quarantine. I believe Italy is now in that category as well. Other countries may soon be added to that list. That seems to be one of the principal responses that the federal government is making in response to the epidemic. Local travel, I think, is going to be a more difficult issue as we see as we see the disease spread. Right? And just take our state for example, especially since I'm expecting most of us are here. Right? We have Westchester right now seems to be epicenter for New York State. There's more cases in Westchester than there are anywhere else. I'm here in Albany County. There's not yet a reported case in Albany County, but there are 2 in a county in Warren County, not far away from here. There are reported cases, documented cases actually in counties in Western Massachusetts and in Vermont that now border New York State. So we're seeing a spread. We're seeing a spread up the Hudson River as well. Can we say to staff, stay out of those places, don't travel to those places? Possibly, but those will be very hard things to enforce. I think you're going to come back to, when people come back to the office, come back to the factory, wherever their workplace is, you're going to be looking at, are they showing any signs? Are they showing anything that looks as though it could be a disease, right? We can all say to staff and employees and others, don't come here, you're sick, right? Saying you obviously, right, you're sneezing, you're coughing, you're doing those things. But can we say to somebody, don't come here because of where you've been? That's going to be a much more difficult piece at this point, until the public health authorities put something behind you to say, yes, this person is now returning from what would be regarded as a dangerous place, a hot spot. We could see, and we haven't seen it yet, but Mayor Bill de Blasio was asked yesterday, could he quarantine the city of New York? Right, and he was pushed by a reporter on that point. He didn't want to say yes, but he ultimately did. Not to say anybody was going to do that kind of thing, but we're seeing it, and we're seeing it in the Western democracy. We're seeing it in Italy. Could we see various areas be cut off and then said, okay, now we know you've gone to a quarantined area. We're not going to let you come back to the office. I think that's right. Again, that's going to be a different answer to a different question.
Pete, can I address that real quickly as a follow-up? I can't hear you, Pete.
Yes, please.
Yes, okay.
I'm sorry. Go
All
ahead.
right. I just wanted to add to Hermie's comment that I have a couple of clients down here whose employees come from different countries, and they're planning vacations. So so the employer sent out a communication warning the employees about their personal travel, and especially if they're not U.S. citizens, that there is no guarantee that they may be permitted back in the U.S. if they are subject to some kind of quarantine in a foreign country. So that kind of message going out as a warning, and basically telling employees you're taking on a risk that you'll be without pay for a period of time because you're doing this voluntarily. I think that's a good message to send, because it also gives some comfort to other employees who are worried about where everybody else is going on vacation.
Thanks, Monica. I did want to offer Jen a chance to make any last comments.
Sure. Thanks, Pete. I guess I would just encourage everyone, so much of this is a case-by-case basis. I think it's really important to keep in mind that decisions should be based on the facts. When there's a lot of information out there that seems scary to folks, and I think people are making decisions or feeling compelled to make decisions for their business or their institution based on that. And if you have questions, I really encourage you to look at the facts of the situation to see if it applies. Certainly, with what we do know, there's various different populations that are at different risks. There's different types of jobs. If you clean airplanes, for example, as opposed to work in a place where you really rarely interact with the public. I mean, those are various risks to contemplate that really you can make based on the facts that are out there. And I don't think everything is a one-size-fits-all situation. And so you might hear something that's happening with one business that maybe doesn't apply to yours, or maybe does. And I guess I would also just say in conclusion that this is a communicable disease. I think Hermes raises a great point. Communicable diseases have been going on for a long time. The flu, for example, I did the statistics, and more people got the flu in New York City yesterday than coronavirus by 54,000 times. So that is still happening. And so I think we need to make sure that we're continuing to stick to our policies that guided you for a long time. And certainly there will be nuances that will have to change for this. But, you know, we're all happy to help answer those questions if you have them. But just keep the facts in mind.
Thank you, Jen. And thanks, everybody. And thank you to all of our clients and friends who are participating today. We obviously did not get to all the questions. I think I know what we're going to do, and that we're going to assemble those questions and put together an information memo that tries to answer the most prevalent ones here. We'll get something out shortly. And we will also have the ability, obviously, to address some of these in our next webinar next week. Mark your calendars, please. Tuesday at 12. We'll do this for as long as you know, this continues to occupy so much of our attention. Thank you so much for attending today. We would ask that you please complete the survey and have a good afternoon.